Alrighty, welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee, and it is Wednesday, July 10th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the hot seat, obviously getting up to the season. Want to break down some of the coaches that are under just a little bit of fire going into this season, and how some of them are definitely going to be out of the job by the end of the season. I can almost promise you that. Then we'll get into Texas football. It feels like 2024 might just be a huge year for Texas. It might just be the biggest year in their history, and I'll break down why I think that and why it's going to be a really, really interesting year for the Longhorns. Then we'll continue into talking points around the Big Ten. We've bounced around a ton over the last couple of days, but we'll do one more today and then probably move on to the SEC, I think, tomorrow. Then we have a little bit of an SEC segment today. We're going to break down the biggest freshmen for the SEC contenders. We'll likely do this with all the Power 4 conferences over the next couple of days and break down some of the biggest players that are coming in as their first year. And then we'll do a Wednesday What If all around the Clemson Tigers. There are so many what ifs going into this season with Clemson, so I want to break down three that I think are super important to what they're going to be this upcoming season. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always fun for the both of us. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in, and let's start talking about the hot seat, because we're getting up close to the season, and there's a couple of coaches that are going into the season with a lot on their shoulders, some for different reasons than others. I'll talk about Texas here in the second segment, but there are a couple of coaches that are walking into this pretty much coaching for their jobs. And it was an interesting article that Dennis Dodd put out over at CBS that kind of broke down all of the coaches across the country and how safe are they on this rating scale. And I kind of want to break that down for you to start here. And it's pretty simple. It's a 5-0 scale. 5 being the worst. If you don't win, essentially you're fired. 4, you got to start improving, got to start moving forward very quickly, or you could be finding the door. Pressure is mounting is one that might apply to more coaches than you expect, because there's some competitive pressure around some of the big-time teams this year that if they don't perform, there will be some people looking in that direction. Then you have the all good for now group where they've been doing their job for the time being, but could fall into hard times over the next couple of years and things get just a little bit sketchy with their job security. And then you have safe and secure, the ones that are totally comfortable where they are, no chance they're going anywhere. And then the untouchables, the Kirby Smart, the Kyle Whittinghams, those type of coaches that they're not getting fired almost regardless of what happens this upcoming year, anything on the field at least. Obviously, this is going to be a huge topic of conversation throughout the year, and Dennis Dodd only had one coach in the win now or be fired section. And I'll talk about why I would have one more coach in that section here in a second, but let's talk about that first guy, and it's Sam Pittman. And I think everyone kind of understands this. He came to Arkansas with all of this hype. He's coming from kind of an interesting situation, making that jump from O-line coach to head coach is not usually the way that people go about business, but this is a very well-liked guy, a fantastic recruiter, someone that is about as good as creating relationships with his players as anyone in the country. It feels like everyone that goes to that school really loves who he is as a person. Now, the problem is that after that first year where they really did make some noise and people thought something might be happening over there in Fayetteville, they've taken some steps backwards, and they've pretty much continuously done that over the last couple of years, and it's sparked some changes around there, and that's part of the reason that I'm a little bit worried about Sam Pittman going into this year, because they hired Bobby Petrino as their offensive coordinator this past cycle. Very, very interesting hire for about 10 million different reasons that if you know college football, you know about. But it does feel like there is a little bit of sentiment around some of the college football, sphere talking about this, that he's not just there to be the OC. He's not just there to, call plays for 1 year and then if Sam Pittman gets fired, find his way to another job. He might just be the head coach in waiting. I think everyone, including the AD over there at Arkansas, saw what was happening and saw that they could have to replace a coach here pretty soon. And while I think Bobby Petrino is quite the choice for Arkansas to go forward with, it could be that's the way it goes about business. And the interesting question with all of this every year when we talk about the hot seat is how many wins do they need? What's the moniker that everyone can say, okay, we're fine with that. That's good enough to get him another year. I tend to think 6 is probably enough for Pittman this upcoming year. I think with the schedule that they play, if they get to a bowl game, he's safe. I feel pretty confident about that. The issue is that's a different scale for absolutely everyone in that room, and a lot of people making the decisions have different monikers that they want him to hit. So it'll be really interesting to see, but as I'm talking to you right now, I would bet that Sam Pittman will likely not be the head coach of Arkansas going forward. I wish he would, because I absolutely love the guy. I think he's one of the best personalities in all of the sport. But at the end of the day, I don't expect him to be the Arkansas head coach in 2025. But the other guy, and it's a guy that pretty much everyone talks about when they talk about the hot seat segment, Billy Napier. And this is a guy that Dennis Dodd did not put in the win now or be fired group. I would. I'll be totally honest. And it might be a little bit unfair because there are some things in there in that Florida program that are really, really good. I understand that, the wins have not been there. I understand that it's been a little bit frustrating of a time there for Billy Napier. But the reality is, if the talent level is getting better every single year, no matter what, they're adding guys that they didn't add in past iterations under Billy Napier. That's just the truth. The overall talent level of this team is getting higher every single year. I think the culture of this team has really been untouched, which is kind of remarkable to me and is a huge testament to Billy Napier and his staff, and especially the players, for staying as involved as possible. But there comes a time when a decision needs to be made, and this is almost harder to figure out what that moniker is to win X number of games and you're safe than Sam Pittman, because I don't know what the Florida brass wants. I don't know what they're looking for from this season for Billy Napier. I don't know if they want 7 wins or 8 wins or maybe even 9 wins. They shouldn't want 9 wins, but there are some people down there that are really sick and tired of being second fiddle, being the team that no one really thinks about as much in the SEC, and it could be that he's out the door even if he has a good season. I've said on here before, if they go 7-5, they're a top 25 team in the country. Does that keep him his job? I would think so, but I don't necessarily know that. And I think one of the big things here is really 2 guys on that roster. If they're on the roster going forward, I think it means Billy Napier is still the head coach. If they're not, I think he won't be. And that sounds a little bit crazy. That sounds a little bit grandiose, but the reality is, if DJ Lagway and LJ McCray are on that campus and they want to play for Billy Napier and Billy Napier only, there is a big incentive for Gators to keep him intact, because DJ Lagway is a game changer. There's no two ways about that. Everyone that has seen this kid play has said he can flip a program on its head overnight, and that's the chance that you kind of run. If you fire him, maybe he walks out the door. If you don't fire him, maybe he walks out the door when he sees what happens this season. Who knows? It's such an interesting situation. It's why this is the one that everyone leads with. It's why everyone's talking about this one the most readily, because it's the most confusing, and it's at the biggest brand, and it's at the biggest school, and it's going to be fascinating to watch this unfold, because it's a really, really hard schedule, so I have no earthly idea if it needs to be 5, 6, 7, 8 wins for him to keep his job, but it'll be interesting. I tend to believe he won't be the head coach in 2025, but who knows? He's a very good coach. I think he's very capable. It's just the cards are really stacked against him. Let's just put it that way. And then we have 2 guys that are in the pressure is mounting group, and they're 2 big-time head coaches, Ryan Day and Mario Cristobal. And Ryan Day in particular, no one needs to be told this. Everyone has said it is national championship or bust for this team. I believe that to a certain extent. I do think that they need to, get in that conversation. But once you get into that national championship game, everything's up in the air anyway. So it's a little bit less than national championship or bust. But at the end of the day, he's got to perform. There's no two ways about that. I don't think he's necessarily gone unless they go 8-4 and lose to Michigan and miss the Big Ten championship and don't make the playoff. Then we're having a conversation. But I don't expect that to happen. I'll just be totally honest with you. I do think they're going to get to the Big Ten title at least. I do think they're going to get to the playoff at least, and I think he'll be fine for this year. But you got to beat Michigan. That's the big one here. If he doesn't beat Michigan, then there will be a lot of people kicking down the AD's door to make sure that he is not the head coach going forward. But overall, he will be the head coach in 2025. The question is, does he go into 2025 at the number 5 ranking of this list and not in the number 3 spot? So that'll be really interesting to watch. And then Mario Cristobal. Obviously, this is kind of an interesting one because since he's walked into Miami, everything has gotten better. The infrastructure has gotten a lot stronger. The NIL game, they're playing incredibly well. Recruiting is on a totally different level. The talent level at the positions that they need them to be is so much stronger. So everything is moving in the right direction. The issue is you've just pushed all your chips to the center of the table. That's what Miami did over this offseason. A couple of different teams did this throughout the offseason, but especially them, they said, we are out to win a ACC title, to go to a playoff, to prove to everyone that we are back in the national conversation. What if they don't do that? What if they go 8 wins, 9 wins, and have an up and down season, and like we had last year, a couple of mistakes by Mario Cristobal and his staff cost them some games? If that happens, we're having a real conversation where going into year 4, where in the past it used to be, you get at least 4 years before we start thinking about firing you. He'd be going into year 4 having to win a ton of games if he was going to keep that job. So it'll be really, really fascinating to watch. I do think he's going to be there in 2025, partly because I think Miami's going to be so good. But depending on how this season goes, it could be a very interesting conversation in 2025 with just how good he has to be to keep that job. But then I want to move on to a couple other guys that are just under a little bit of worry. Definitely have to be looking over their shoulder just a little bit. And the first one is Dave Aranda. And this is a really, really interesting one. He jumped into that job and just took off. In 2021, he won that championship in his second year as head coach. Blake Shapen, who is now the starter at Mississippi State, was the guy for the Bears that year and was fantastic through the back end of that season. And this one's going to be a little bit tough because they've been 6-7, 3-9 the last 2 years, and the talent level has dropped pretty significantly in those 2 years. And the big news for him is bringing in someone like Daquan Finn is huge. He opens a door that has not been opened at Baylor the last couple of years, which is you can hand the ball to him and just let him make a play. And that is something that when you have some of the offensive struggles that I expect Baylor to have at some points, having a guy like that is a game changer. So I do think that bringing him in is absolutely huge for him, and I do think that Dave Aranda is going to be able to keep his job throughout this year, but there's definitely a bottoming out perspective where if Daquan Finn goes down with an injury, God forbid, or if they just don't play as well as he expects to play, it could get really sketchy down there, and a tenure that started just incredibly well could come to a real crashing halt pretty quickly. And then the other guy, Clark Lee at Vanderbilt, frankly, I don't know what Vandy wants their head coach of football to do at this point. I'd love to tell you that Vandy can start making turns and they can start recruiting at a higher level and utilize the portal and maybe become a player in the SEC. They are so far away from doing that, it's not even funny. The roster level, the staff, the infrastructure, everything is not where it needs to be, and they need to fix it as quickly as possible, but I have no idea what the moniker is here. I think it might just be 3 games. If they win 3 or 4 games, I think he keeps his job, and with Diego Pavia at quarterback, I expect them to do that. So frankly, I don't know what Vandy and head coaches, I don't know what that relationship is meant to be because, and I don't know what they're expecting them to pull off because Vandy's just not a place that you're going to win football games, at least not right now, and I don't know if a head coach is going to change that right now. So kind of feel for Clark Lee in that sense, but could be out the door at the end of the year. And then Kalani Sitake is a very interesting one because I think he's in a really tough spot because if they had 2 or 3 years in the Big 12 before all the other guys came in to kind of set their feet, get comfortable, and recruit at a higher level, I think they'd be okay. The problem is Utah is coming in ahead of you. I would argue Colorado is coming in ahead of you. I know Arizona is coming in ahead of you. All of those teams are now, you just got kicked down a couple of pegs, and it's going to be really hard to build that back up. Now, BYU does have a really good fan base, has a great atmosphere, could win some big-time games and get some momentum going, but as of right now, it just looks like there's not a lot happening for BYU, at least in the right direction, and they'll have to figure it out, or Kalani Sitake could be looking for a new job this time in about 6 months. But obviously, not the greatest of conversations. You always hate to see coaches get fired, but at the end of the day, it's the nature of the job. There's always going to be a couple of big-time firings, and I think if you're going to circle any of them, circle Fayetteville, Arkansas, and Gainesville, Florida, for the two that I tend to believe are going to go down this year and could be huge openings for whoever takes them. But we'll take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to break down Texas. There's so much going into this year, and it might just be the most important year in Texas football history. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows where 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the different hot seat coaches out there and how there's going to be a couple that end up getting the can at the end of the year, and it'll be interesting to see what the openings are. There are some big ones in the SEC that could be opening, but let's jump into Texas and let's talk about how is this the biggest year in Texas football history? And I know that sounds crazy when I say it, and I felt crazy when I was writing it yesterday, but I don't necessarily think it's incorrect. I think there's so much going into this year, and Texas has a chance to do something this year that they haven't done since 2009, which is essentially stamp themselves as one of the best programs in the country. There's been this sentiment that I've seen around Texas recruiting lately as they've kind of gone through a little bit of a tough patch, where it was CJ Vogel talking about this over at On Texas Football. Just fantastic. If you are a Texas fan, definitely go subscribe over there. But he was talking about Texas recruiting, and he was talking about how Texas is viewed among recruits right now in high school, and they weren't around really, or at least weren't really paying attention when Texas was really relevant the last time, back in 2009, 2005, when they were just dominating people. They don't really remember that. They remember the decade that is known as the dark decade for Texas football fans, and that has played a huge part in their recruiting efforts the last couple of years. They've been doing a great job. They obviously, Steve Sarkisian and company have built up some really, really remarkable classes the last couple of years, but they've run into some trouble for a very simple reason, which is essentially just the recruits don't know what Texas is yet. And they know that last year was incredible. They know that a lot of momentum is heading in the right direction. They know that there is a ton of things to really like about this team. They also know that there are a ton of things to like about a lot of the teams that Texas has had over the past couple of years and over the past decade. So it's hard for them to say, we saw what you did last year and it was really impressive, but I'm going to need to see it again and maybe one more time before I feel fully confident in you being a program that is not just here for a couple of years, but is here for a very long time. So all of this goes into this season. It's going to be huge for Texas for just infinite amount of reasons. Steve Sarkisian could, totally leave everything in his past and be one of the premier coaches in this country at the end of the year. And the good news is for Texas fans, there's a lot of things moving in the right direction. Just about everything is moving in the right direction for Texas. I mean, you have the quarterback coming back in Quinn Ewers that is just out of this world. There's no two ways about that. I don't think anyone's questioning that, frankly. But there's so much more that goes into it, obviously. There's obviously tons of people, deeper on the depth chart. You have, obviously, Arch Manning right behind him. That makes them feel very good about their situation. But Steve Sarkisian has built up a group of players that is just ridiculous, to be totally honest with you. I would have them either the third or the fourth best roster in the country, depending on where you put them against Oregon. And I think when you look at just across the board, the skill players are just ridiculous. Jaden Blue and CJ Baxter is one of the best duos in the country. The wide receiver portal position, when you add guys like Isaiah Bond, Matthew Golden, Silas Bolden, the worry of them not being as good is way lessened because they're very much seasoned veterans. The O-line is one of the best in the country, led by one of the best offensive tackles in the country, by Kelvin Banks, a very, very talented guy, likely a top 10 pick in 2025's draft. The D-line could be stronger, but definitely got stronger throughout the portal. You have Alfred Collins and Vernon Broughton, who will likely be the starters there, but then you brought in a guy like Bill Norton, who's going to be absolutely huge. You stole Jermaine Lole from Oklahoma late on in the process, which was massive for this team. So a lot of really good things they did in the portal there. The linebacking duo, I think, is really awesome and one of the more underrated parts of this team. Anthony Hill and David Benda, I think, are going to be a fantastic duo, and I think Anthony Hill might be a guy that can develop into an all-SEC type player. Maybe not this year, but throughout his time at Texas, he's just going to be incredible. And then his DB group is really solid. Obviously, this was a worry last year, but what they did over the offseason was huge, which was they just got a lot of veteran talent. They got a lot of guys that know exactly where to be, know exactly how to, play coverages, exactly how to go through film study, which is a huge part of that. And they're just going to be smarter. They're not necessarily, they didn't take any massive leaps necessarily in the overall talent of the group. I don't necessarily think it changed, to the nth degree or anything like that, but I do think they have all of the guys that they need to have. I think Jahdae Barron is the most important guy because he might just play nickel, corner, and safety at different points during this season. Andrew Makuba is huge coming in from Clemson, a very smart, experienced guy. Michael Taff on the other side is going to be huge. Derek Williams, another fantastic safety that absolutely can play some really good football. They just have a lot going for them. And then I think Manny Muhammad, Gavin Holmes, Javion Cole are going to be huge for the corners. Those are likely the guys. And then Jelani McDonald's another one to watch back there. But overall, the roster is just ridiculous. I think everyone understands that when they look at Texas at this point. It's led by Quinn Ewers and that quarterback room. But overall, there's really nothing out of place. And then you look at the staff. It's elite top to bottom. It's pretty much the same as the roster. I mean, you look at what Steve Sarkisian has done the last couple of years, asserted himself at least towards the top of the head coaches in the country. Kyle Flood is a fantastic offensive line developer and also serves as offensive coordinator. Pete Kwiatkowski is the DC that everyone does have some mixed opinions on, to be totally fair. But at the end of the day, every year that he's been there, the defense has improved. They've gotten better. The talent has gotten better, but also just the scheme has gotten a lot better every single year. And then the impressive thing, more than anything else, with Steve Sarkisian, with this staff, is how he's replaced some of the openings that have formed. Bo Davis left for LSU. He filled it with Kenny Baker. And that one, the jury's still out on Kenny Baker a little bit because of some of the recruiting troubles, but always going to be an issue with an NFL coach coming down. And if he can develop the guys this year and play some really good football on that D-line, it's not going to be a problem. I can almost promise you that. Jeff Choate also left this offseason to become the head coach at Nevada. He brought in Johnny Nansen, who was a DC at Arizona a year ago. So all the craziness that happened over at Tucson definitely favored Texas a little bit. And this is a fantastic recruiter with really good roots out in Utah, really good roots over a little bit more west. Just does a fantastic job on the recruiting trail. And then other moves before this year. You have Brennan Marion. They brought in Chris Jackson from the NFL level, and he's done a fantastic job his first couple of years. Stan Drayton took the job as a head coach over at Temple. They brought in Tashard Choice, who I would argue is the best running back coach in the country. So a lot going right in the staff over there in Austin. And the guy up top, Steve Sarkisian, that's making all of these decisions, that's pulling all of these levers, is pulling him at the perfect moment and doing just incredible jobs of it. And then finally, something that we talked about yesterday with Oregon that fully applies to Texas as well is the alignment at Texas. It's remarkable how many people at Texas are finally pulling in the same direction. I think a lot of people remember how crazy the time was there for quite some time because that wasn't the case. Whether it was the boosters or the AD or the president or whoever it was, someone was pulling against the head coach. Someone was pulling against this program or just not necessarily as gung-ho on the coach to put that amount of money into the program. No longer the case, not by any stretch of the imagination. Chris Del Conte, the AD right there, with Steve Sarkisian, the boosters, which are really the domino and the one that make everyone around Texas just a little bit nervous every year. But at the end of the day, Steve Sarkisian walked in, knew that this was going to be a tough job to handle because of all the outside noise and because of all the people that have their hands in what you're doing. And he's handled it beautifully. He's done an incredible job of taking what is a really daunting job in a lot of different ways and just taking off from pretty much the get-go. So I think this has been a huge year and a huge thing for him, which he walked into a situation that over the past, decade was really sketchy. But Chris Del Conte, the AD, deserves all the credit in the world because he got everyone on the same page. He made sure everyone was pulling in the same direction, and it's led to a really incredible run for Texas football. But it's got to continue, and that's the biggest thing about this year and why I think it's such a big year for Texas football is you're walking into a monster. There's no two ways about that, and Texas knows that. Steve Sarkisian knows that. Brent Venables knows that about Oklahoma as well. But at the end of the day, you're walking into the monster that is the SEC. I know there are a lot of Texas fans that frankly are wrong and say that the physicality won't be a problem, that they'll be able to handle it. And Texas is well more equipped than most schools in the country to handle the SEC schedule grind. But you never know until you get in it. You never know how tough that game is coming back from Starkville or coming back from Vandy or coming back from one of the South Carolina playing a game there. Your body hurts just a little bit more, and it's just a little bit tougher to get up the next day and go to workouts and do everything you need to do, and that's a thing that you only learn from being in it. Now, it's not to say that they can't handle it. They absolutely can. They have tons of physical guys. The amount of guys they have on the offensive line that are over 300 pounds is just ridiculous, but overall, this is a huge year for them in 10 different ways. Steve Sarkisian can stamp himself as one of the premier coaches in this sport. Texas can get back to the top and not just say, we're here for a year, but we're sticking around for quite some time, regardless of the conference that we're in. They can prove everyone that says they can't handle the SEC totally wrong and run through it and maybe win 10, 11 games, go to the title game, and if they win it, then everything gets really interesting in Austin because we talked about it with Oregon where they just needed a spark plug. They just needed that 1 year, and obviously last year was huge for Texas to get them back into that conversation at least, but it's usually the year after the year for a lot of these programs that defines you. It's usually the one right after you've had that massive success, you've broken through, you've done all the things that you wanted to do, then you have to prove that you're going to do it year over year. And so I think 2024 is one of those years that Texas football is back in the conversation. There's no two ways about that. They're one of the big-time teams going into this year, but you got to deliver this year. And if you don't deliver this year, then recruiting will pretty much stay where it is right now because the recruits will see what they expected to see. There are a lot of guys that are skeptical of what Texas is going to be over the next couple of years. If you confirm that in their minds, they're going to find other places to play. So it's not to say that if Texas doesn't have a great 2024, they're in trouble or they're down the drain by any means. But it is to say this is a fantastic opportunity for Texas to take everything back, to be the premier team in college football, to win a national title, to recruit at an incredibly high level, and maybe, just maybe, leave a lot of teams in the dust. So it could be a huge year for so many people in that program, but overall, Texas football could be looking back on 2024 as one of the most defining years in their history at the end of it. So it'll be fascinating to watch that, but we're going to take our second break. And when we come back, we're going to get right back into talking points around the Big Ten. Wanted to break down one last Big Ten segment here, so we'll do that right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about Texas and how I think 2024 might just be one of the most defining years in Texas football history. There's so much going into this year with hype and everything coming off a big-time 2023, but can they execute will be a fantastic thing to watch this upcoming year. But let's get back into talking points around the Big Ten. I did not quite get what I wanted out of this yesterday, so wanted to continue today, and probably we'll move on to the SEC or maybe the Big 12 tomorrow, but we'll break that down later. But let's jump in, and I want to start with talking about Washington and Wisconsin, because I weirdly feel like they're kind of in the same boat as they walk into a new Big Ten this year, and I think this is kind of it's the case for a lot of these teams, but especially these two teams. I think you find yourself kind of in a weird spot. Everyone's dubbing, Oregon, Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State. They're off in their own world. I think those are the four teams that everyone feels really good about being players for a long time in the Big Ten, and I fully agree with that. I think there's another group of teams. There's Nebraska, Iowa, USC, a couple others that have the chance to, be in that conversation up to towards the top or find their way back towards the bottom. It's another thing that I've talked about on here a lot, where in these new big-time power conferences, there's not going to be enough wins to go around. That's just the reality of the situation, and it could get sketchy for a couple of these teams, and Washington could be one of those teams. Now, Jedd Fisch had an absolutely magical run at Arizona a year ago, and I'm hoping that is going to continue because I think it's absolutely awesome to watch this guy call an offense. But at the end of the day, Kalen DeBoer left, and pretty much everyone did with him. There is not a lot returning for this team. They had to do a ton of work through the portal. Will Rogers, the guy that has to be going into about his 10th year in college football, is their starting quarterback this upcoming year, and there's a ton going into this year. But at the end of the day, this is a very talented team. There's no two ways about that, and a very capable program, as we saw a year ago. I think they have that ability to get to the Oregon, Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State conversation. They also could be behind Nebraska, Iowa, USC if the next couple of years don't go the way that Washington wants it to go. So the landing is going to be maybe more important for Washington than any other team in the Big Ten. I think USC might be a little bit more important, but I do think Washington has a ton riding on this year. Just show that you belong. It doesn't necessarily have to be a great year. I'm not expecting 9-10 wins, but if they can get to 8-4, even if they can get to 7-5 and prove that in some of those 5 games, you can hang around a little bit, I would feel pretty confident in them. But it's going to be a huge year for them, and the next couple are going to be fascinating to see just where they fit in this conversation. And then Wisconsin's another one. And I'm a little bit more bullish on Wisconsin because of Luke Fickell. I think he's one of the best coaches in the country, and I think he's done just incredible stuff since he's shown up in Madison. But at the end of the day, they're in the same boat. They're in a weird situation where Oregon comes in ahead of them. You could argue USC comes in ahead of them, and you have to figure out how to go about business. How are you going to kind of close that gap? And I think Luke Fickell's doing a fantastic job, but you only have so much time before a lot of these big-time schools find their footing. Oregon, Ohio State just run away with this conference. Maybe Michigan joins them. But at the end of the day, Wisconsin's in such an interesting position where if they can find their way past Nebraska this year, if they can find their way past Iowa and past USC this year, then I think they'll stay there. I think if this year doesn't go the way they want to and they lose to Nebraska and lose to Iowa and fall below USC in the rankings, it could get a little interesting. So Washington and Wisconsin are two teams that I'm just watching a little bit closer this upcoming year. Not necessarily, writing big-time conclusions off this year, but all to say, this is a huge year for these teams to figure out just where they sit. So it'll be interesting to see which UW is sitting on a higher pedestal moving forward in this conference, because I think those might be the two that are really fighting for that spot. But let's get into some lower-level teams that could play spoiler this upcoming year, because I think there's a good bit of them, honestly, and I want to start with Indiana. There's a couple that stand out above the pack, about 3 that I'll get into, but Indiana is the number one, and I think it's Curt Cignetti. He came into this program that, frankly, was just not that interesting of a program. With all due respect to all the Hoosiers out there, it was a program that just didn't have a lot of juice over the last couple of years, and obviously the Michael Penix year that feels like it was ages ago at this point, was fantastic, but the talent level is as high today as it was back then. He is doing really, really incredible things through the portal. Adding a guy like CJ West is huge. There were so many big-time teams after him, and it was not easy to reel that guy in, but getting him from Kent State is going to be a huge addition. Also, having moving on a little bit too quickly here, but I do think Indiana has a ton riding on this, or a ton going into the season, and I think everything is just moving in the right direction. I saw a picture of Julian Lewis wearing an Indiana shirt a couple of days ago. If he flips to Indiana, that will be the greatest recruitment anyone has ever pulled off, and I'm not even exaggerating. It'll be absolutely remarkable. But the other team that I'm watching is Rutgers. I think Rutgers has been a little bit under the radar, but they're doing incredible things on the recruiting trail. Greg Schiano has done a great job building out the foundation of this program, and then showing everyone what it is, which is you're not going to outright beat us. You are not going to come in and just bully us for 4 quarters. We are going to play tough, we're going to play physical, and we're not going to make life easy on you. And when you have a guy like Kyle Montague who runs the ball the way he does, it helps a lot. I won't argue with that, but I do think everything is heading in the right direction. Everything feels like it's just the momentum around there is just a little bit different than it was before. And I'm not saying they're going to, jump into the big time conversation this year, but they absolutely could play some spoiler for some of the big guys up top. And then Michigan State is the other one that I'm watching in particular. Jonathan Smith bringing in what's going to be, I think, a really, really successful program. But the biggest thing more than anything that he is bringing in that's important to Michigan State is stability. They never had it when Mel Tucker was in town for a number of different reasons, but at the end of the day, bringing stability, bringing a comfort level for some of these fans is huge. And I think also, like we talked about with Rutgers, having a guy like Aiden Childs to start this thing off and have a kind of a launch pad for this program under Jonathan Smith is absolutely huge. So very, very much expect a huge season from them. Cannot wait for that. And then let's get into Michigan. They're kind of under the radar, and I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but they are coming off a national title, so much going into this year, but Ohio State, Oregon are dominating the conversation when you talk about the Big Ten, and frankly, I think it's one very simple reason. Harbaugh's not there anymore. I think if Harbaugh was there, we'd be hearing so much more about the off-field stuff, about the Connor Stallions, about the recruiting violations, about everything in between about Michigan, and they wouldn't be flying as under the radar. But I think with all of the changes out there, roster included, it's kind of taken a little bit of the shine away from them. But doesn't mean they can't be successful. And frankly, I think they like not being focused on, if I'm being totally honest. I think that's the way that they go about business. They like working in darkness and then just showing up on Saturday and kicking your teeth in. That's the way that they like to play football. So I think while Oregon and Ohio State, in my opinion, are the best teams in this conference, I do think Michigan is a team that might just be overlooked just a little bit and might be able to prove us wrong. If Alex Orji comes along the way that they hope he will, this is a really good team with a really high floor and another team that's just not going to let you beat them. They're going to run the ball, they're going to play good defense, and they're going to just wear you down. So it'll be fascinating to watch how that kind of moves into the season because I just don't think people are talking about Clemson and Jerome Moore just quite enough. I think we have to hear about them just a little bit more as we head further and further into this season because they hold a little bit more power than I think some people are expecting them. But at the end of the day, we'll find out once the ball kicks off. And then finally, I want to talk about this game because I think we could see this game more than one time. I think we could see this game more than 2 times this upcoming season. Ohio State and Oregon is one of the most anticipated games going into this season. That game in Eugene is just going to be incredible. It's going to be one of the most defining games this upcoming season, one of the most fun, and right up there with Texas and Georgia in terms of the hype going into that one. But at the end of the day, I think these two could meet plenty of times throughout the season, to be totally honest. This is the reality of the new non-division format where if you play Oregon one time or if you play, this could happen with Michigan and Ohio State, absolutely, where you no longer have divisions, you're no longer split up, so you could play a team twice that you already played earlier in the season, and you could play Michigan again right after you just played them. So that would be a very interesting thing, but Oregon-Ohio State is the one that I tend to believe has the best path to meet multiple times. Florida State-Clemson is the other one that I think is really, really definitely has a chance of this happening and will be fascinating to watch. But this one's going to be huge because I could see both these teams walking into this game undefeated. I could see both of them walking out of this game, one loss, but going 11-1, the other one going 12-0, meeting up in Indianapolis, and see what happens from there. Then you have two 12-1 teams. One is likely the 1 seed overall, one's likely the 5 seed, and then they might face off again. So it would be incredible to watch all of this unfold, but it's the reality of the 12-team playoff. Some people hate it. I tend to believe that as long as the two teams that are meant to be playing each other are playing each other in terms of seeding and difficulty, I'm more than fine. I would watch this game 13 times in a row if that's what needed to happen for the right national champion to be decided. I got no problem with that. So I understand that this is one that people kind of have some mixed opinions on, but overall, anytime that I can see two of these top programs go at each other, I have no problem with that. So will be awesome to watch that. Cannot wait to see some of the games that we get to see this upcoming year. But let's take our third break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some freshmen. I want to get into the freshman the freshman players for all of the contenders across every conference. We're going to start today in the SEC. I think we have 9 teams here that I think are contenders, quote unquote. Some are a little bit lower than others, but at the end of the day, want to break down some first-year guys that I think are just going to have huge impacts for them. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the talking points going into the Big Ten. That will likely wrap it up for the Big Ten. We'll move on to another conference tomorrow, but let's get into some of the biggest freshmen going into this year. There are so many. I think this year in particular, I feel like we're going to see a lot of freshmen making a lot of big-time plays. Obviously, the big one is Dylan Raiola out in Nebraska, but we're going to start with the SEC today and break down some of the big-time contenders and who I think is going to make an immediate impact for them. And I want to start with Georgia. And frankly, I included both these guys in this picture because I can't choose between either of them. I chose Ellis Robinson initially, and then over the night I started thinking about KJ Bolden. But regardless, both these guys are hugely important. I think Ellis Robinson has a little bit of a different task ahead of him, and I think it's mainly because Malachi Starks does not play corner. If you have the best guy in the back end at your position like KJ Bolden does, there's a little bit less pressure on yourself. I think Ellis Robinson might be a guy that you need to trot out there pretty early on. I do believe Daniel Harris is going to be a good player. I think Dalen Everett is a fantastic player, but I think Ellis Robinson is one of those guys that is going to be called on at big moments, whether it's through injury or through some different things. I think he's going to be called on at a moment where he just has to make a play. And you'll find that they're going to attack him a lot because he's a freshman guy, because he's a little bit undersized for that corner position. He's fantastic in coverage, but overall, they're going to attack him, and he's going to have to make some plays for UGA this upcoming season. So I'd lean Ellis Robinson by a hair, but both those guys in that picture, KJ Bolden included, are just going to be hugely important for this team. And then we'll move right along to Texas. Colin Simmons is the answer. I know Ryan Wingo is making a ton of headlines around there, but Colin Simmons they just need. Texas over the last couple of years, the pass rushing has just not been good, plain and simple. And it's been a couple of different reasons, some scheme-related, some player-related, but this guy is as pure of a pass rusher as you will find, especially coming out of high school. He just does ridiculous things. I believe he had 20 sacks his senior year of high school. It's just ridiculous what he did on the football field down there at Duncanville. But the point of this is he's going to see a ton of snaps pretty much from the get-go. I don't know if he's going to start, although he might. But I do think he's someone that's going to be huge for them late on in the season when he's gotten his feet under him and he can kind of just unleash his pass rushing ability. He's going to be scary. And then obviously Ryan Wingo is another candidate here, a fantastic wide receiver that's been playing really, really good football. But I'm not worried about wide receiver at Texas, and I won't be for quite some time, I don't think. So I'm not necessarily too worried about that. I think Colin Simmons is much more important to Texas' success. And then Xavier Brown is the easy answer for Bama, to be totally honest with you. Ryan Williams is another wide receiver that definitely will play a part, but at the end of the day, they need help in the back end. They need people to step up. They need young people to step up, and this is the main among them. Xavier Brown will likely be the starter across from Domani Jackson when the season starts, and he's got to start really fast, to be totally honest with you. Obviously, they do have a little bit of a warm-up game to start the year, I believe against Western Carolina, if I'm not mistaken. But then they go to Wisconsin, and then they have a little bit of a buffer. Then they play Georgia. So he doesn't really have a lot of time to get accustomed to things. He doesn't really have a lot of time to play some lower-level talent that he can play some really good football against and get that confidence up. He's got to be ready to go because I understand people are kind of scoffing and laughing off that Wisconsin game. If the back end is not as secure as it needs to be in that game, it could get interesting pretty quickly. I'll just be totally honest. I do really like Xavier Brown, and I think he's going to be a fantastic player, but if it takes him some time to get there, which it likely will, it could be a tough first couple of weeks for that back end of Bama's defense. But it'll be fascinating to watch that. I think Xavier Brown is going to be huge for this team this upcoming year. Ole Miss had less people to choose from. I'll be totally honest. As we all know, they lean into the portal a little bit more aggressively than some of these other teams, but Cam Franklin's going to be huge. I feel very confident about that. I do think the D-line is strong. I think the front line D-line and a couple of guys in that back end are going to be really, really capable. The depth isn't great. The depth isn't necessarily where you want it to be. That tends to be the trouble when you lean into the portal as aggressively as they did. You don't necessarily leave you a ton of ability to have the depth that you would like to have at those positions. Not to say that they don't have a really good defensive line and very capable, but just to say that's the worry that I have for this team is the D-line and the O-line depth, to be totally honest with you. Worried about both those positions, but Cam Franklin could help that a ton. If he comes onto the scene and really just makes an impact pretty much right away, he could be huge. And going on with a guy like Walter Nolan or a guy like Chris Hardy, who's a fantastic player they brought in from Jacksonville State, I think all of those guys could be hugely important to his success this upcoming season and developing him into the player that he really can be throughout his time, which is really darn good, frankly. Another D lineman on this list, Dominic McKinley, total layup for LSU. There's no question they need a guy on the defensive line, and I think Dominic McKinley might just be the guy that you see, his freshman year he came in and Bo Davis came in as the defensive line coach. When he walks out, I'm going to be just astounded to see what the development has been because this kid is already special. He's already incredible in so many different ways. With Bo Davis next to him, it's going to be really incredible to watch what he can do. But the problem for him is he almost has to be incredible this year. They have, I don't want to say no one on the D-line. He probably won't start on the D-line from the get-go, but he's going to get snaps from the get-go, and he's going to have to be huge throughout the season, and I would not be surprised one bit if he was the most impactful D-lineman they had by the end of the season, if I'm being totally honest. And while that's not necessarily ideal for this situation, it does give you a good idea of how good this kid can be. But then let's move on to Texas A&M. Terry Bussey is hugely important for this team. He's going to play corner to start. I feel very confident about that. But at the end of the day, he's going to be really hard to keep off the field. There's no two ways about that. Mike Elko has even talked about that, where he said, we're going to put him in some return game stuff. We're going to put him possibly on offense at time or two, because in high school, he racked up 169 offensive touchdowns and 24 picks. The kid was just everywhere. It was absolutely remarkable. That's why so many people were after him. And when they beat out Texas for this kid, A&M fans were jumping for joy, and they should have been, because this guy is just absolutely incredible. Cannot wait to see him get underway. And I think, while I think the wide receiver position is really strong and the cornerback position definitely needs a little bit more help, it might be hard to keep this guy off the side of the ball that, not his better side by any means. He's really good on either side, but it might just be hard to keep him off the offensive side of the ball is the best way to put it. But then let's move on to Tennessee. Boo Carter is the guy that I'm picking here. Mike Matthews has a ton going into this year, obviously. Jordan Ross was the top-rated guy in this class coming in, but this guy's different for a number of different reasons. And the biggest one is kind of like Terry Bussey. He can do anything you want him to do. Literally anything you want him to do. It's really remarkable. They reviews he got out of spring were just insane, to be totally honest with you. He's going to return kicks for Tennessee this upcoming year, and I would not be surprised at all if we were watching some Tennessee games and that winning play, that play that put them over the top and gave them that big-time win, was made by this guy. I think he's an absolute difference maker, not only at the safety position, but also returning kicks, also maybe as a gadget guy on, like, this guy literally just put him on the field and let him make plays, because it's going to be incredible to watch. And I think with all of the guys that Tennessee has to worry about, adding him to the bunch is just unfair to some defenses out there. But at the end of the day, it's going to be awesome to watch him. Oklahoma, adding David Stone was huge. It's a huge position of need, kind of going back to what LSU is under. Definitely less dire up at Oklahoma, I'll say that. But at the end of the day, this guy is huge. He was the best player in the freshman class for Oklahoma. He's someone that is coming into a room that is really interesting, because I really like the front line, defensive line that they have. I think DeJoun Terry and Dominic Williams is a fantastic duo, one of the better duos in the conference and in the country overall. The problem is behind that, there's not too much. There's a couple of guys that will make some impacts here and there, but at the end of the day, there's not enough there to feel really confident about that position. If David Stone walks in and balls right away, it won't be an issue. And he's a player that is fully capable of doing that. So really excited to see what he can pull off. I think he's one of those guys that every time you hear his name brought up around Oklahoma fans, they just get giddy. They get that big smile across their face, because this kid is special and he's going to do some really, really remarkable things, but he might just need to do it very, very quickly for Oklahoma to be successful. But then Missouri, Williams-Nwaneri, no question about this one, an edge rusher that is just going to be absolutely huge. I thought about Courtney Crutchfield. I think he's going to be really good, but wide receivers I'm not too worried about. Trajan Greco is going to be a big player, because that back end I am a little bit worried about. But when I talk about Williams-Nwaneri, I think he was the biggest commitment that they've gotten in quite some time, and he's going to be one of the biggest players this upcoming year. And I think having Zion Young and Darius Smith that came in from the portal from the edge is going to be huge for him, because the reality is he's going to have to learn the ropes a little bit. He is such a remarkable physical specimen that sometimes you get to the next level and you don't necessarily have the technical tools that you need. With those two guys helping him out, he'll have no problem. I can almost promise you that. I also think Johnny Walker Jr. is a really good player, so he'll have plenty of guys to play off of, and I think at the end of the year, there could be a world where Williams-Nwaneri is the most disruptive player that they have on that team. So a ton of big-time freshmen in the SEC this year. There's no two ways about that. And that doesn't even include who I think is going to be freshman of the year in this conference in Cam Coleman down in Auburn. So there is going to be so much going on in the SEC around the freshman class. LJ McCray over at Florida is going to be huge. Perry Thompson at Auburn is going to be huge. So a ton of guys that I'm just so excited to watch, but wanted to keep it to the teams that are just a little bit higher on the odds to win the conference. So we'll continue doing that. We'll wait. We'll probably do the Big Ten tomorrow and then continue on and maybe use that as a moniker to go forward on schedule releases and breaking down some of the rosters and things of that nature as we get closer and closer to the season. But for now, we'll take our last break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some Wednesday what-ifs. We're going to get into Clemson football because there's about 1 million what-ifs around Crimson football, but we'll break down 3 of them today, and we might just have to do this next week, I'll be totally honest with you. But stick with us, and we'll be right back with that. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the most impactful freshmen when you go through the SEC contenders. We'll continue that throughout the next couple of days, probably get into the Big Ten tomorrow and just keep rolling throughout a lot of the previews that we'll be doing as the season comes closer. But let's get into some Wednesday what-ifs. There is so much going on with the Clemson Tigers as we head into this season, and I have about as many what-ifs for Clemson as I have for any team in the country, to be totally honest with you, because not only is there so much happening on the field, but off the field is a totally other story that is just as big. But let's break down some of the biggest questions I have, and the biggest one I have is what happens with Cade Klubnik, because there's two different paths here, right? We saw what happened last year where it just felt like him and Garrett Riley were just not on the same wavelength. They were just not on the same page for a lot of the things that they were doing, whether it was the play calls just didn't feel like they fit what Cade Klubnik can do, or there just wasn't that connection that you need to have an elite offense, especially when you're playing some of the teams that Clemson's going to play. The thing is, Cade Klubnik has every single tool you could possibly want. That's why he came out of high school as such a highly touted guy. The arm's incredible. He does have the mobility. He does have the athleticism you need. Everything is there. There's not a thing about this kid that makes him just impossible to be successful. He can be a really, really remarkable quarterback, but he's got to hit that next level, and that falls on the shoulders of a lot more people than him, and mainly it falls on the shoulders of that guy. Garrett Riley just has to be much better this year, and it's not necessarily to say that he was downright bad a year ago, but it is to say he's got to play to Cade Klubnik's strength just a little bit better. He's got to be able to get these wide receivers open a little bit better by scheming, because frankly, it's not the greatest wide receiver group, although I do think it's a little bit stronger than years past. I think Adam Randall, Troy Stellato, Antonio Williams are all really good veteran guys to have for someone that is a little bit on the younger side. Jake Burningstool, another guy that's going to be absolutely huge for them this upcoming year. But then the young guys are really the separators. Those are the guys that really will take you from a competent offense to an elite offense. And those are Tyler Brown, who I think is going to have a really, really good year, frankly. Bryant Wesco made huge waves in the spring and is a fantastic player. And then TJ Moore is another freshman that came in that just has talent oozing out of his ears. So there's so many guys that can make stuff happen for Cade Klubnik, but at the end of the day, there's so much that goes into it, but Cade Klubnik's got to make the plays, right? He's got to make the right decisions. He's got to use the mobility that he has. He's got to use his legs. He's got to get more dynamic in this offense, and I don't think he's that far from doing that. So there is a path where he totally breaks out, and if he does totally breaks out, if he's one of those players that we're talking about pretty much every day, and we're just in awe of his season, and maybe he's on a Heisman-type track, wrap it up for the rest of the ACC. I'm just being totally honest. The rest of this team is far too good for if he comes along the way that they want him to, they will be in Charlotte and likely win the ACC and maybe go undefeated in that path, because that is the thing that held them back last year. There was a lot of things in place last year, and obviously there were a couple of things that you would like to be a little bit better. The wide receiver group was not great, which obviously did not help this situation by any means. But regardless, the quarterback play was the thing that separated them from those couple of wins that would have taken them over the hump. So it's a huge year for this kid. I think he has every single ability to be successful. Garrett Riley's a fantastic play caller, as we saw at TCU. The wide receivers are so much better this year than they were a year ago. The O-line is going to be really good, led by Blake Miller on the right tackle position. But overall, this is a huge year for this kid, and if he hits his ceiling, it's over for the rest of the ACC. They win that conference. If he doesn't, the questions around Clemson just get that much louder, that much bigger, and that's kind of what I want to get into in my second question, which is, what if they go 8-4 or 9-3 and miss the ACC title? What if something like last year happens again? And I really don't know the answer to this. I'll be totally honest with you. I know that it makes a number of people across the country smile ear to ear because they like to hear the idea of Dabo's downfall. But at the end of the day, this is going to be a really, really interesting year for them. And there's so much riding on this year, not just because a 9-3 year over the last couple of years has been disappointing for Clemson, but there's so many questions about the way that they go about business in terms of roster construction, in terms of not going after the portal, which in some ways I absolutely love that Dabo does that. In some ways I absolutely hate it. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, but at the end of the day, there's going to be questions if he goes through this year let's say it's 9-3, and you have losses to UGA, Florida State, and NC State, or Virginia Tech is that third one. That's a good year. Let's just be totally honest. Those 3 losses are not necessarily anything terrible. They could be, weird situations where Clemson loses a, bounce of ball type play and misses out on a game. It doesn't change that it's going to make those fans angry. It doesn't change that it's going to make a lot of people mad. And there are some people in that building, I'm confident there are some people in that building that make big time decisions that don't necessarily love that Dabo doesn't go after the portal, that don't necessarily love that NIL is not as big of a part of their equation as it is for some of the other superpowers out there. And they got to do something about it, one way or the other. If they go 8-4 this year and there's questions around what they're doing going forward, and are they continuing on this slippery slope, and is Miami and Florida State jumping them in the ACC? If all of that stuff is happening before your eyes, there's going to be people asking Dabo to change his ways. There's going to be people asking Dabo to dip into the portal, to use NIL, and I don't know if he's going to do it. And I kind of respect him for that, for standing on his principles, for doing what he thinks is right, not what everyone else wants him to do. But it is to say, this is going to be a very interesting conversation. If they go 8-4, if they, continue to kind of slide off the hill just a little bit, people are going to start wondering about Dabo and his long-term future at Clemson. Now, he's safe for quite some time. Let's be totally honest. He's got 2 national titles against Nick Saban, so it's not necessarily going to be a big issue. But the reality is, you have a year in front of you that is so important, not only for what happens on the field, but how people view Dabo Swinney, how people view how the program goes about business, how people in that building ask them to go about business. So it's going to be really interesting. But at the end of the day, Clemson has opened a little bit of a door this year where everyone is going this direction. We're going to go against the grain, and you might be trying to get 1% better in the portal. We're going to develop the guys that we have now and get 10% better. So it's all kind of a fight back and forth, and it could go either way, to be totally honest with you. But if they go 8-4 this year, if they go 9-3 even, I think there's going to be some people that have a sit down with Dabo and say, look, you're the head coach here. We want you to be here for a very long time, but we can't keep doing this and expect to be better in years coming forward. Now, I do think they're going to be successful this year, but at the end of the day, there will be questions if they're not. That's for sure. And then finally, I want to talk about the back end of this defense, because I look across this entire roster, and there's not really many true concerns. The wide receivers you'd love to see be a little bit better, but other than that, I really don't have many problems. The D-line and linebackers are absolutely elite across the board. The back end of the defense is a little bit wary. And it's not necessarily that it's not good. I think a guy like Avion Terrell, this guy right here, is hugely important. AJ's brother, if you know the name. A very, very good player, played some really good football a year ago, and will be huge for them. There's no two ways about that, especially with Nate Wiggins walking out the door. He's CB1 now, and he's got to act that way. And then losing guys like Andrew Makuba to Texas and Toriano Pride Jr. to Missouri were big-time losses. There's no two ways about that. I do think one guy that makes this just a little bit easier is R.J. Mickens, a hugely important guy and is a veteran in that group, which is very, very important. When you have a group that might be a little bit less experienced, having a guy in the center of it that is going to be in total control is massive. It's the same situation with Bama and Malachi Moore. I worry a little bit about some of the pieces in that room, but when you have a guy like Malachi Moore holding everything in place, you're going to be really successful. So I really do think this back end could be really good, but there are my worries. There's no two ways about that. The depth is not necessarily as good as you'd want it to be. The frontline guys I think are going to be good, but I don't know. There's kind of this weird, you have some of these players behind the front line that are very talented young players but don't have the experience you want, or you have some of the experience but not necessarily the level that you'd love to play. So guys like Corey and Gibson coming in as a freshman is going to be huge for this team, but overall, they're going to face some really good passing attacks. It starts in week 1 against Georgia, and frankly, I'm going to be totally honest, I expect them to get torched that game. I expect Carson Beck to do just mean things to that back end, but overall, when you get into conference, you still have Florida State, you do have NC State, you do have Virginia Tech, so you are going to have to worry about some really good attacks, and it'll be interesting to see how they handle it, because if they fall on their butt and they don't necessarily do what they want them to do, it could be a really ugly season, frankly. It could be that 8-4 season that we were just talking about. Now, I do think they're going to have a good back end. I think they're going to be capable, but if they're not totally locked down in some of these games, it could lead to some losses, and the margins are just razor thin in that conference this year. So I do think they have the dudes, no doubt about that, but I do think it's going to take some time for them to get comfortable, to get in their groove, and it could be too late by that point, to be totally honest with you. So it'll be interesting to watch that. I really do think that this is a very fantastic team going into this year, but the questions around them are just plentiful. There's no two ways about that. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages you could possibly need for all of the content you could possibly need. We have you totally covered in the world of sports, whatever you need. So come on over to GSMC and take in whatever you want. We got plenty of people covering every single sport you could possibly want. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.